Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. So I'm going to be talking about some aspects of my recent book that just came out through Oxford University Press. And at first, I want to begin by talking about the title of the book and where that comes from, because I think there are a variety of things that people mean when they talk about collapse. And so I just want to sort of focus on what those terms specifically mean to the communities that I focused on and that I studied, and what it means in sort of a broader context. So to begin with, I'll just say that for my research, I was looking at two different communities who were engaged in different forms of urban agriculture. For the first case, I did research in Cuba and Havana at a farm that was sort of created after Cuba experienced its own economic collapse. So in the early 90s, after the Soviet Union collapse, Cuba was obtaining a lot of resources from the Soviet Union, things in the way of a lot of food and petroleum. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba faced its own collapse in the sense that they weren't able to obtain those needed resources, a lot of food and petroleum, and had to figure out a way to survive that. And what they decided to do, and what they put a lot of energy toward, was to build up their urban agriculture. And to specifically make urban agriculture that was organic, that didn't require a lot of petroleum, and that could feed people in the places where they mostly were, and that was in urban spaces. So today, there are some cities where about 100% of the fruits and vegetables that people consume within those cities actually come from urban farms located nearby in their neighborhoods. So that was the first case where they actually experience a type of collapse, and they move towards this urban food production specifically to potentially access more food sovereignty to be able to produce food where people were. For the second case, I looked at an urban eco-village in the Pacific Northwest in the United States. And I just should say that for anonymity purposes or confidentiality, I promised all of my subjects that I wouldn't name their sites or their names. So anything that you do hear from me as a name is going to be a pseudonym. For the case in the United States, it's an eco-village, and what that means is it's a type of intentional community where people come together to live in a particular way that's environmentally friendly and sustainable, and for them, they really focus on this term sustainability as something that they sort of orient around and organize around. And they actually do live together in a small community in an urban space. I'll tell you more about that later on in the talk. But for them, this idea of collapse might be more similar to what I think a lot of Westerners think about when they think about collapse, in the sense that they're thinking about it in terms of the sort of impending potential civilization collapse for the Western world as a result of a variety of ecological crises, but especially as a result of climate change, and that interacting with a variety of other potential environmental crises. So for them, collapse is more of something that's they're oriented more towards the potential future. And as part of what they're trying to do is to sort of live in a way where they're almost prepping for that eventuality. So that's what it means in terms of both of the cases that I look at. And I know that here, in terms of the academic meaning of this, recently at the University of Tennessee, I remember had an apocalypse themed semester through the College of Arts and Sciences. And in fact, I actually taught a class based on that theme. Of course, that happened at the beginning of 2020, in the spring of 2020, and of course, the pandemic interrupted that semester. So I know collapse is very much potentially on people's minds as of recently. And I want to say that too, it's in people's minds in terms of popular culture and within the activist sphere as well. Prior to that apocalypse themed semester, I was listening to a podcast called How to Survive the End of the World that was very much about this idea of societal collapse as a result of all these sort of converging ecological crises. But one of the things that they talk about, and so I want to sort of also add this sort of dimension to this term as well to sort of think about throughout, what they talk about is that for many people, they have experienced collapse already. And not just sort of like in the, long ago history, but even in sort of recent history. So thinking about specifically Indigenous communities all over the world, but especially in what is now considered North America, but also the African diaspora, who many of whom were people who came here not of their own volition. They were actually kidnapped and enslaved by these sort of Western colonizers. So, so from the perspective of this podcast, they're talking about these sort of older but more recent sort of forms of apocalypse that have occurred to communities that still are alive and exist today. And how what we mean by collapse generally now is more of a collapse of a Western society. So I am sensitive to the fact that there are different meanings to collapse. And I feel like with that, I should acknowledge that the University of Tennessee is built upon the traditional territory of the Juligi and Soyaha peoples, who are an ongoing presence in the region and beyond today. So I just wanted to mention that these are different ideas about collapse, and to tell you where I'm coming from and some of the other ways in which people talk about collapse. And I also want to note that for some Indigenous scholars and activists, they have written recently about the fact that they sort of see this current form, this potential of collapse of Western society as just sort of a logical extension of the long-term processes of colonization and exploitation that have been going on for hundreds of years. So they sort of see this as a natural conclusion to that sort of exploitative types of relationships to the environment and to people. So with that, I want to move on to the next slide. Okay, and for this slide, essentially what I'm trying to do here is give you a sense of sort of the complexity of all of these sort of interrelated processes that are going on, these interrelated dynamics. So in terms of sustainability, when people talk about sustainability, they're usually referring to, well, there are many definitions of sustainability, first of all, I want to say. And in my book, I do problematize this term quite a lot. But in terms of what it means, and the most commonly cited definition comes from the Brundtland Report in 1987. And this definition of sustainability sees sustainability as a three-pronged process. So in terms of this type of sustainability, they're talking about social equity, environmental sustainability, as well as economic sustainability. And all of these things are supposed to be working in tandem towards a larger sort of sustainable development. I want to say that also, as a social scientist, specifically as a sociologist, the part that I'm the most interested in is the social piece, so that social equity piece. Specifically, I'm interested in how social equity and inequity relate to other complex environmental cycles and processes. So here you can kind of see a variety of ecological or planetary cycles, and the sort of picture is really looking at sort of the social and economic impacts of those. And I want to say that they're all interlinked and they relate to each other in a variety of complicated ways. And I'm hoping to sort of give you all at least a little sense of how the social equity piece relates to the environmental piece today, and how that relates to the cases that I'm going to present. So we can go ahead and move on. Oh, and I want to say too that in terms of the social piece, when I was talking about too what some of the Indigenous scholars had written about previously about the long processes of colonization, part of the idea of the exploitation of people here, they don't see, as Western society does, that these social processes are completely divergent from ecological processes. They actually see them as interrelated and interlinked. And so for them, exploitation of people is similar to ecological processes of exploitation. They're not necessarily separate things that are happening. For our part in Western society, we see the social and economic as very sort of divergent or different than these ecological processes. So here I want to try to pull these back together so we can kind of look at what they look like together in relationship to each other. So next slide. Okay. So the way that I'm going to enter into this sort of social processes conversation is through food. That's how we'll enter into this. And there are a couple of reasons why I focus on agriculture in the book and here. And that is because one way in which all people interact with their environment almost every day, hopefully every day, is by food. It's part of the human condition that we all have to eat. And our food comes from somewhere. And so I want to talk about where our food currently comes from and some of those dynamics and what some of the things that people are thinking that we might be able to do differently. Specifically, industrial agricultural practices are the predominant types of agriculture that are that are done here in North America and in many parts of the world, and increasingly all over the world. So we're moving more towards this industrial form of agriculture. We know there are a lot of problems associated with this type of agriculture. So I just want to talk a little bit about what this agriculture looks like. Generally, it's done in monoculture form over large swaths of land. It requires tilling, heavy machinery, and the use of a lot of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, as well as a lot of irrigation. So a lot of water is utilized for this type of agriculture. And what the science is starting to say about this agriculture, this type of agriculture, is that it has a variety of environmental impacts and affects a variety of different biospheric systems. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those here. For instance, this type of agriculture, especially the tilling aspect of this type of agriculture, does a lot to disrupt the nutrient cycle. It affects the amount of nutrients and minerals within the soil. It also does quite a bit to kill a variety of supportive microbes and insects, especially with the use of pesticides. This type of agriculture makes the soil more brittle, less sort of sponge-like, and so it doesn't retain water as well. It's far less efficient with regard to water absorption and also for nutrient absorption. It emits a lot of CO2 from the soil, as well as nitrous oxide from the synthetic fertilizers that are being used on this type of agriculture. And it also accounts for 78% of eutrophication that we see in our waterways, which is the nutrient runoff, because not all of the nutrients are contained in the soil or taken up by the plants. So a lot of that runs off into our waterways, creating dead zones. So it's part of the problem with this type of agriculture. Next slide. This type of agriculture also has a variety of other problems associated with it. So in terms of this type of agriculture, again, it requires a lot of irrigation, which accounts for about 70% of the total of freshwater consumption throughout the world. And in the United States West, it's about 80% of the water is used for irrigation of agriculture. This is a problem considering that over 2 billion people lack access to safe drinking water, and this demand is expected to increase a lot by mid-century. And especially as a result of climate change, there are concerns about a variety of waterways drying up from droughts and from other problems associated with climate change. So this is a real problem in terms of water for access for people. Agriculture also accounts for about 30% of greenhouse gases. The entire process from growing it to transporting it to processing it to the waste that it produces accounts for about 30% of greenhouse gases. In the United States, agriculture accounts for about 80% of nitrous oxide emissions in the US, and also 35% of methane emissions come from industrial agriculture. These things are, all a problem in themselves, and climate change is its own issue. The issues with water are also specific issues, but they're all interrelated and they all work together to create other problems too. One of the things that scientists say that we're moving towards is a sixth mass extinction. And they're saying that this is largely due to land use change. Because of agriculture, a lot of land is bulldozed specifically for the purposes of large scale agriculture. So you can think of forests and savannas and a variety of other habitats, but also the use of agrochemicals. And the World Wildlife Fund has been keeping tabs of some thousands of species, vertebrate species, since the 1970s, and have found a 68% decline in their populations since the 1970s. And then more recently, studies have come out about this huge decrease in insect populations and how concerning that is for the food web, considering so many other species rely on insects to be able to eat and to survive. So this has wide-reaching implications for not just us, but also for other species on the planet as well. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization predicts that industrial agriculture will destroy the remaining topsoil in the next 60 years. And that they report that we've already lost about half of our topsoil in the last 150 years, and about a third of what is left is degraded. So you can see industrial agriculture has huge impacts, and it's one way in which humans relate to the natural world and is an integral to sustaining our livelihoods. And is a way in which we impact the environment. Okay, next slide. So I want to bring in the social equity piece to talk about how it relates to environmental quality, because I'm not sure that this is entirely obvious to everyone. Many people who study sustainability say that social equity is the least theorized, though I think that a variety of environmental sociologists would not agree with that particular statement, because we've been talking about social equity with regard to the environment for quite a long time. So environmental justice scholars have done a lot of important work on this. To begin with, since the 1980s, they've documented how much environmental impacts have affected especially poor, low-income communities and disproportionately communities of color. And what that means is that in our society and around the world, what you are able to see is that poor communities, low-income communities, disproportionately communities of color are located in places where there are also a variety of locally unwanted land uses. And what people mean by locally unwanted land uses are things like waste dumps, incinerators, manufacturing facilities, mining, any kind of chemical processing. They're just located, their communities, their actual neighborhoods are physically located near these locally unwanted land uses. And low-income people often work in these kinds of jobs. These are the kinds of jobs they're able to get. So these kinds of jobs, which are not only there in their communities, are also places where people often who are low-income often work. And in these situations, they're exposed to a variety of environmental hazards and toxins that affluent people generally are not exposed to, at least not to such a degree as these communities are. So in particular, if they live near a toxic waste facility, they're likely to be exposed to anything that might end up in coming out of that facility into their neighborhoods. If they're located near a chemical plant, any sort of particulate or anything that comes out of the air, they're also being exposed to. So it also creates a variety of health effects, not just for the people who live in those communities, but also for the people who work within those facilities as well. So the kind of research that I've done with my colleagues is sort of looking at the opposite effect here. So environmental justice scholarship generally looks at the ways in which these environmental hazards harm these low-income communities, these disproportionately communities of color. But we have been looking at inequality in a different way and looking at the ways in which social inequality can actually have environmental impacts of its own. So specifically, some of the research that we've done has found that CO2 emissions per capita are higher in nations where women have lower political status. We found that in more gender equal nations, the association between GDP per capita and CO2 emissions is much lower than in nations with higher levels of gender inequality. I've seen from so much more other research demonstrations of these types of environmental impacts based on social inequality, such as increased income inequality is correlated with increased water consumption and air and water pollution, as well as lower survival rates for children. A greater presence of women in community decision-making bodies leads to better protection of common property resources, according to multiple reports, but especially this one here from the UN. Racial residential segregation leads to environmental inequalities and lengthens car commutes and vehicle miles traveled, which worsen air and water quality overall. And all of this research sort of culminates to say that inequality not only leads to disparities in environmental exposures that disproportionately burden the disadvantaged, but also leads to higher overall levels of exposure to health damaging pollutants for everyone. So they actually have found that in communities that have more income inequality, everyone is more highly affected in those communities, even the more affluent people. Next slide. So this article came out last year in Science. It was done by some urban ecologists. And I think it just visually represents issues that I'm talking about a lot better than some of the stuff that I just explained in the last slide. And I also want to note that this is a study I wish that I had done, because it just so perfectly visually sort of illuminates the processes that I'm talking about, but somebody else did it. So I just want to talk about it a little bit so you can see physically what social inequality looks like and how it actually physically manifests as environmental harm. Actual environmental problems are located in these spaces of these huge disparities, right? So here, this article is looking at the historical process of redlining and how it's maintained racial residential segregation for a very long time. So the practice of redlining really began in the mid-century last century. And in this process, what happened was realtors, mortgage brokers, city planners, a variety of people came together and specifically designed and decided to split up cities into these different grades of neighborhoods. And they did this intentionally with sort of a racist ideology and desire to keep neighborhoods segregated. So specifically, you can see here that where you have these green or blue line neighborhoods, these are the higher graded neighborhoods. For a neighborhood to have a higher grade, they'd have to have more environmental amenities. For them to have a lower grade, they're considered to be more dangerous neighborhoods, places that are located near these locally unwanted land uses that I talked about before, places that might have more particulate matter in the air that might be more unhealthy. And they actually physically split people up based on these different grades of neighborhoods by race. So in the green and blue neighborhoods, they would take white or more affluent people or families to go and look at homes there. And in these orange and red neighborhoods, so I want to note too that this redlining process, part of the reason why they call it that is they literally took out markers and maps and these markers with different colors and drew lines around the parts of the city where they were going to bring Black people and Latinx people to look at homes and where they were going to take white people to look at homes. So in the orange and the red, this is where they would take Latinx families and Black families to go and look at homes. You can also see though that here what they did was they overlaid these different colored maps with this view of urban tree canopy and urban vegetation. So you can see there is a huge relationship between neighborhoods that are in these green and blue lined areas and urban tree cover. And here in these orange and red line neighborhoods, you can see a lack of all of that vegetation that is present in some of these cities. And so in some of these spaces, you can actually see more tree cover in these blue areas and less so in these red areas. And this is a physical manifestation of what it looks like physically for income inequality or for racial residential segregation. Next slide. And this is just a continuation of that same article, just to sort of look at what that might look like as sort of an overlay. So here they have this picture to sort of talk about how some of these effects are compounding. So you have things like gentrification, employment issues, residential segregation, law enforcement, immigration policy, these sort of systemic biases that are then overlaid with these really physical manifestations of some of those systemic biases and how that relates to ecosystems here on the top. Just to sort of give you an idea. So impervious surface cover, generally talking about concrete. So this would be parking lots, roadways, probably more industrial activity. In places where there's more concrete or impervious surface cover, you're likely to see more heat island effects. People in communities with these larger heat island effects, if they're lower income, which they usually are, may not have access to things like air conditioning or things that could protect them from some of this heat. The other thing that you can see in this overlay is the green space and tree cover issue. So impervious surface cover doesn't give you a lot of space to plant vegetation. So there's not going to be a lot of trees or other kinds of plants located in that area. And as a result of it, trees can't do some of the things that they so amazingly do in our urban spaces. They take in particulate matter, they create their own microclimates, so it's actually cooler near trees and vegetation. They also can draw down carbon dioxide and various particulates. So you can see without the trees there, you have greater heat island effects, and also you have more environmental pollutants that are located there. Now that would be there for a variety of reasons, right? It's because of, this, again, this impervious surface cover. Likely there's a lot of traffic, so that would affect particulate matter in the air, but also you might have other activity, industrial activity, that would be contributing to these environmental pollutants. You can also see that in these spaces, you often don't find as many resources there. So one of the ways in which I think about inequality and the way it relates to the environment is that the way that we pattern or we organize socially in these social hierarchies very much determines who has access to a variety of good environmental resources and who has access to a variety of environmental disamenities, so living near locally unwanted land uses in particular, or who don't have as much access to these environmental goods that I'm talking about. So just to sort of make that more less abstract and clear, what I mean by that is to say that generally the most affluent in a community usually have access to neighborhoods where they have cleaner air, they might have parks nearby, they likely have grocery stores with healthy food located near them. They also are able to purchase goods from, all these goods are coming from the environment from all over the world. They have access to these things, whereas poor people and people with less economic resources are not going to be able to purchase foods or items from anywhere in the world as easily, or they have limited choices with regard to that. But also they are often located in neighborhoods where they don't have access to grocery stores that have healthful food. They more likely have convenience stores or liquor stores nearby. They don't have as much access to things like even health clinics or good public transportation in their neighborhoods. They also are more likely to live near these locally unwanted land uses. And as a result, their health suffers for all of these reasons. And so you can think about inequality as a way in which we actually distribute environmental goods to where the more affluent or the people at the top of our social hierarchies have more access, and the people at the bottom of our social hierarchies have far less access to environmental resources. But also, this is a way in which we also distribute environmental harms. So people with more affluence having less, experiencing less of the toxicity and pollutants that people in these low-income neighborhoods are more likely to experience. And you can actually physically see this in these neighborhoods. And here they also talk about the disease dynamic. Of course, if you don't have access to healthful food and you're near a variety of environmental pollutants, you're going to have a whole host of diseases that also congregate in those spaces for those reasons. And then this has also physical effects on the ecology, on urban ecologies. So in the more affluent spaces, you're likely to see a lot more biodiversity. And in the less affluent places, you're likely to see a lot less biodiversity. And I thought this visual just sort of more clearly depicted how these social inequalities work with environmental problems as well. Next slide. Okay, and all of these things are a problem for a variety of reasons. So I'm making the case here that inequality is in some ways bad for the environment, actually. And there's a variety of research articles that I've pointed to, and I've shown you some of the ways in which that physically happens. But right now I'm sort of interested in this problem of climate change. So in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report from 2018, that's where this graph comes from. They talk about how close we are to reaching a 1.5 degrees Celsius change in global average temperatures. I want to note that this report was sort of written as a response to the United Nations meeting in Paris, as a response to the Paris Agreement, where they talked about the differences between reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming versus 2 degrees Celsius of warming, and what those two different numbers, what they would actually look like and how they might actually affect people in these different ways. So I just wanted to sort of talk about where we are and where we're going with this. And of course, agriculture, as I mentioned before, is implicated in this because as I noted, 30% of our greenhouse gases actually come from agricultural production. So in terms of what's going on here, we can see that climate change is already happening. This isn't something that's going to happen in the future. This is something that's currently happening right now. So here we are in 2021, and we've already reached about close to 1.2 degrees Celsius change in global average temperature since the pre-industrial period. In 2017, we already reached 1 degree Celsius change above the pre-industrial levels, and we're on track to meet that 2 degrees Celsius rise in global average temperatures by mid-century. Some people are concerned that we might even as soon as 2060 see a 4 degrees rise in global average temperatures. But for the most part, people are saying or sort of projecting that we'll see about between 4 and 6 degrees or potentially as high as 7 degrees rise in global average temperatures under a business as usual. If we change nothing at all and we continue doing things as we do them now, we may be seeing those higher increases in global average temperatures by the end of the century, and especially here in mid-century too. So I just want to talk about what that means for people. Next slide. So the World Bank produced a report, and there was a special issue, and I can't remember the name of the journal right now, that talked about what a 4 degrees rise in global average temperatures would mean. I know this doesn't sound like a lot, and I'm sure many of you know that our Earth systems or planetary systems are very sensitive to these changes, even in small amounts. And specifically, when the last ice age was about 4 degrees cooler than it is now, and all that took was 4 degrees to be in an ice age. So we're moving into something a bit of the opposite of that. So here's just a visual to sort of give you a sense of what the world will look like if we raise global average temperatures up to 4 degrees Celsius. So right here in the middle, you can see all of this area in the red in the tropics is largely going to be uninhabitable for much of the year because it'll be too hot. Here in the yellow, they're saying this is likely to be inhospitable desert, so it's not likely going to be a place where people can grow a lot of food. And they're projecting that a lot of people are going to have to live closer to the poles in order to be able to survive the temperatures, but also to be able to grow food. So most food will be grown in these polar regions. And I want to also point to this piece right here, the oceanic dead zones and the issues with coral reefs. Coral reefs are projected to be near extinction by mid-century for sure. And then phytoplankton too. This I read about this in a report that came out in 2015 that talked about how sensitive phytoplankton are to changing temperatures in the ocean, but as well as to the acidification that's happening as a result of all the CO2 that the ocean is absorbing from the atmosphere. And the report was saying that with a potential 5 degrees rise in global average temperatures, so this is a projection, so I just want to say they don't know for certain, but they're projecting that this is a possibility, that with 5 degrees rise in global average temperatures, that the phytoplankton are so sensitive to the temperatures in the ocean that they could likely die off. And I just want to note the significance of that, because I think it is extremely significant to be able to understand that phytoplankton actually produce about 70% of the oxygen in the atmosphere. So if they were to die off, we would lose a lot of our atmospheric oxygen. And that would not be a great situation for people. In fact, I remember reading the science writing on this that came out in an article in a newspaper that was, the sort of tagline was, if the phytoplankton die, breathing at sea level will be similar to breathing at the top of the Himalayas. It would be a way different atmosphere. So I just want to note what we're heading towards so that we understand the complexity of the issue and the problems associated with that. And I can see that people are writing in the chat. I can't really look at those right now. I'll talk about, I'll be happy to talk about any questions here at the end. So next slide. Okay, so all of this to say that I want to just sort of deal with the enormity of the problem and sort of recognize how the complexity of it and how many different systems are interrelated that are working together sort of in tandem, and how they're relating to each other and how they're affecting each other. And I want to move on to the case portion of this talk to get away from sort of like, the doom and gloom and focus more on what it is that people are doing and thinking about in terms of alternatives. So I just want to note that the social psychology research says that we actually need to be talking about potential alternatives in order to combat things like compassion fatigue and some of the more debilitating emotions that come up for people when they hear about these really complex, these really big planetary problems. And so part of the purpose of me writing this book was to do that. I wanted to move in that direction of sort of evaluating alternatives to see what's viable, what's not viable, what could be scalable, but also to sort of combat some of these negative emotions, really, so I could help get people on board with the project. So part of what I'm trying to do with this book is think about possibilities. What alternatives, what exists now? What can we learn from? What could motivate or inspire us? So I start my book with the visioning exercise, and I want to read that portion of that right now for you all, just so you have a sense of what I'm talking about here. So imagine it's the year 2050. Everything has improved since the publication of this book. The global community does better than meeting the Paris Agreement targets and limits global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. All nations transition away from fossil fuels and meet carbon neutral and negative goals. A climate migrant program successfully relocates people to permanent homes abroad. Poverty has been eradicated globally, and everyone is able to comfortably meet their needs. All people can expect quality care and a voice in matters that affect their lives, regardless of ability, age, gender, race, religion, or sexuality. Global indicators of health and happiness are high. Conflict, violence, and war are on the decline everywhere. You yourself, regardless of age, are happy, healthy, and surrounded by a loving and supportive community. How did we get here? Be bold and creative. Imagine the impossible. What does it take for the world to be in this great of a state? Be specific. What does the global economy look like? What are local communities doing? How are their economies shaped? Are they beholden to global markets? How has agriculture changed? How have ecosystems and indigenous ways of knowing been protected? How is your community organized? How do you make decisions? Is everyone involved? And is everyone's input valued equally? So again, I want to note that for me, what I'm researching and specifically what I'm trying to develop knowledge around is how social equity specifically relates to these environmental impacts. So the communities that I look at are communities that really, they sort of organize around more egalitarian principles and values, and also around more regenerative forms of agriculture. So that's what we're going to look at here next. Next slide. So the first community that I looked at really oriented their work around permaculture. I just sort of want to give you a definition of what permaculture is, but also talk about how permaculture differs from the industrial agricultural practices that I was talking about previously. Permaculture is a more holistic systems design, sort of systems oriented way of thinking about agriculture. So it's not just about agriculture. It's also about promoting ecosystem health, but it's also about promoting social system health. So the ways in which people relate to each other is also an important aspect of permaculture. So just to read what I have here, it does have a socially and ecologically integrated mission. It's consciously designed landscapes which mimic the patterns and relationships found in nature while yielding an abundance of food, fiber, and energy for provisions of local needs. It's people, their buildings, and the way they organize themselves are central to permaculture. Thus, the permaculture vision of permanent sustainable agriculture has evolved to one of permanent sustainable culture. And it's the use of systems thinking and design principles that provide the organizing framework for implementing the above visions. So this is what they sort of organize their eco-village around, is this idea of permaculture. Next slide. Okay, and here are some visuals of the village to give you a sense of how this community is organized. And I hope that you can see when I go through this, that this is not just about the ecology and ecosystem of the space, so that's very important. They also organize in a way to be able to work together and to live together more efficiently as well. So the social part is very obvious here to me. So here you can see a top or an area or view of the village. Most of the housing is situated around the perimeter of the village. In the middle, these spaces, this area right here is a workspace. This is where people come together. There's a garage there. They can share tools. And also this is a space where they come together, they congregate for courses they might teach. They do teach about permaculture. They also teach about other things there on the village, natural building, some things related to nonviolent communication, ways to relate to each other more efficiently or effectively. This space right here is the garden space, and here you can see it from another view. And in this space right here, you can see that it's a very diverse space. They're intercropping a variety of things, and they're utilizing a variety of techniques that are found in regenerative forms of agriculture. Here too, they also engage in things like rainwater and catchment. So they make sure that they're getting the most efficient use of resources they possibly can. And then throughout the village, you find spaces like this where people can congregate and just sit and talk. They also engage in other things together in this space, specifically the more social equity piece that I was mentioning earlier. They focus on consensus forms of decision-making, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide. So here, this is from a paper that I wrote about this eco-village, but I want to focus on some of these permaculture principles right here in the middle, just to sort of talk about some of the more social components of permaculture that people at the eco-village adhere to. So the three principles of permaculture are caring for the earth, caring for the people, and sharing the surplus. In terms of caring for the earth, that's very much how they formulate their agriculture and regenerative terms oriented towards the ecosystems there and providing for the ecosystem. But also they do a lot of work in terms of caring for the people and sharing the surplus. Specifically, as I said before, they relate to each other in these more lateral ways of forms of decision-making, whereby in consensus, they meet monthly or sometimes bi-weekly to talk about issues that are going on at the site. And through consensus, they make decisions about how to go about dealing with some of those problems. As an example of this, there was an instance where one woman had brought a bunch of geese on the property, and eventually she wanted to consume the geese. That was her point in bringing the geese. A variety of people didn't like the geese being on the property because geese can be kind of mean and territorial. But one man in particular who was vegan had been caring for the geese, and he spent a lot of time with the geese. And so at this meeting, he brought up, as well as other people, the fact that he didn't want her to eat the geese. And a lot of people were having issues with the geese. So through consensus, they sort of came to a compromise where somebody else offered her some chickens and said, you can eat these chickens. Maybe we could bring the geese to another place. They could live on another farm. And they were able to come to a compromise through these consensus forms of decision-making. And I want to say too that they do a variety of other things to care for each other, nonviolent communication. So thinking about some of the socially sustainable aspects of community life, living in community is hard. People have a lot of conflict. People often aren't taught how to have conflict with each other in productive ways. So people there spend a lot of time trying to learn about how to have conflict in productive ways and ways that would sustain and nourish the community. So they practice things like nonviolent communication, which is a form of communication whereby you really spend a lot of time trying to listen. It's an active listening practice and trying to show compassion for the person that you're listening to. That's just one of many forms of caring that you see happening on the property. Aside from that, there's a lot of sharing, and this is another permaculture principle that's really having to do with not taking too much and not taking an excess. And when you have surplus, making sure that you share the abundance. So they often have potlucks. All of their meetings are potlucks. They bring food to the community that they glean from a variety of other places in the city. They also share the produce that they grow in their garden. And they also share resources and tools and a variety of other things so that not everybody is having to purchase every single item for themselves. So there's a lot of sharing that goes on in the eco-village. Next slide. So the next case that I look at is of an urban farm in Havana, Cuba. And there they practice a regenerative form of agriculture also, but it's a different type. They practice agroecology. I want to note, though, that both agroecology and permaculture share a lot of similar practices, and both are based in a lot of indigenous and local knowledges from the places where they are growing the foods that they're producing. So just to give you a definition of agroecology, it's the study of ecological processes applied to agriculture, bringing ecological principles to bear in agroecosystems. The term may refer to a science, a movement, or a practice. This type of agriculture very much focuses on the ecosystem. So they're very interested in maintaining ecosystem dynamics. So they're looking at the interconnections in nature, making sure to promote health of all the living beings on the site. So this differs from industrial practices, again, because they're not using often a lot of pesticides. They might use a very targeted form of pesticide. Specifically, as an example, at the site this site here that I was looking at, they were practicing looking at the sort of bacteria that killed a certain insect, but was really specific to that type of insect. So that was a type of sort of biological pest management that they engaged in. But they're trying to maintain biodiversity in these spaces and trying not to kill as much as possible. They also are sort of trying to conserve biodiversity, and they also focus a lot on seed freedom. So in thinking about seed freedom and prioritizing these local knowledges and local practices, the way that they sort of differ from industrial practices is that, they do see drought as a potential problem that could very much affect agriculture into the future as a result of climate change worsening as well. But rather than buying sort of drought resistant seed and buying from a specific company and working with their inputs and trying to use that specific seed as a way to deal with drought, they attempt to deal with drought-like conditions in different ways. So they might instead focus on healthy soils, maintaining healthy soils, making sure that the soil can retain more water than an unhealthy soil might be able to retain, and making sure that there's a lot of biodiversity to sort of keep in moisture in a variety of other ways, like through cover crops and intact ecosystems. So next slide. And here you can see some visuals from the farm, sort of give you a sense of what's going on there. This is, I have it sort of done in a bit of a circle to kind of show sort of the circular nature of the space, although it's not entirely a closed loop. They operate similar to one. Here you see a fallow field that is not currently in production, but might be in the future, but is a place where they might take their oxen to feed, and as well to produce manure in that space to sort of regenerate the soil there. They do use draft animals for a variety of purposes, transportation in particular, and some other purposes. Here they take manure and compost to this vermiculture area. So this is all compost that's sitting out. And then right next door, you can see are these vermiculture stations where you have worms that will then eat that compost or manure and turn it into a very highly nutritious worm humus that they then apply to soils that they put the starter plants in. And here you can see the plant nursery with the starter plants. And from there, they take them out into the field. And when they're out in the fields, they actually have a woman who works on site, whose whole purpose, her job is to look at and manage and maintain insect populations. So she walks around the fields looking at the various plants and looking at what insects are there. And if she sees too many of a particular insect that might cause problems or might be a pest to a particular type of crop, she'll go to other parts of the farm and she'll pick out and she'll bring other insects from different parts of the farm to that particular site to sort of manage the populations of those insects. So specifically, if she finds aphids, she might go and find ladybugs to go and eat the aphids. They also engage in a variety of other biological pest management practices on site. As I said earlier, they do sometimes utilize certain bacteria to target certain types of insects. They also engage in push-pull practices whereby they'll intercrop food crops with things like marigolds that actually have sort of repellent properties that insects are not attracted to, they want to steer away from because they don't like the smell. They also, in some cases, might bring in plants that actually attract pests, but aren't crop plants. So things like certain grasses might pull in certain stem borers and sort of trap them in the grasses to keep them away from other kinds of plants that they might infect. So these are some of the biological pest control processes that they engage in. From there, the plants, after they go into the field, when they're harvested, they're then brought out to, this is also on the farm site, they're brought out to the street on a local vending area where they sell their produce directly to the community that lives just across the street from there. So these people can come just from this neighborhood that's right across the street. And anything that they can't sell in the vending area because it's damaged or maybe is a little overripe, they then turn into these sort of value added items, things like tomato paste or certain kinds of pickles in order to sell to the community as well. And then of course, if anything is, too overripe or is no longer good, then they then compost it over here in this area or feed it to the animals. And then this final piece right here, this is the economic office where they bring in profits. This is where they pay their employees, but also reinvest in the urban farm. Next slide. And their particular model of relationships, just talk about sort of how they relate to each other in a more social form. They are a cooperative, so that means all members have ownership in the cooperative. After a member has been working there for 2 months, they have a vote as a community to decide whether or not that person should be part of the cooperative. And once they're let into the cooperative, they are a cooperative member indefinitely. Everyone has a vote at these meetings. They meet monthly to talk about farm issues and come to votes together there. The income there is based on length or term of employment, not in terms of the sector that they work in. So it doesn't matter if you work in the office or if you work in the fields or if you work in the plant nursery. What matters is how long you've been employed there. So your income is based on length of employment specifically. And then all profits are evenly distributed among everyone if they exceed, overhead costs and other things. And I think it's interesting here too to say that all sectors really are valued equally in that space. Next slide. And I want to note there are a variety of benefits to regenerative agriculture. Specifically, regenerative agriculture doesn't have the same problems that industrial agriculture has. All agriculture has impacts, but certainly regenerative has far lesser impacts than industrial agriculture. Regenerative agriculture enhances soils' ability to retain water moisture. It requires less irrigation as a result and loses a lot less water. And also, because the soils are more sponge-like, they're able to take in more nutrients, so they don't require as much in the way of fertilizers. And if you employ things like cover crops or like perennial grasses, agroforestry, this can also improve soil water retention and prevent runoff. Certain geometries of intercropping can also attain water use efficiency up to 39% higher than monocropping. And healthy soils retain and store carbon dioxide. So that's another important aspect of this, especially not utilizing tillings. Tilling specifically disrupts carbon in the soils. So specifically not doing that can help to retain carbon. Regenerative agriculture also increases biodiversity of microorganisms and insects, which, as we've seen at the beginning of this talk, are in huge decline currently. And healthy soils experience a lot less soil erosion. They're more resilient in the face of floods and droughts, which are going to become more common as the climate changes. And healthy soils are also more nutrient dense and are able to produce higher yields as a result. And healthier food crops. There are also a variety of human benefits to these socioecological designs. There's a variety of research that shows that interspecies relationships with plants and animals can decrease blood pressure, cholesterol, decrease loneliness and stress, and can also increase happiness. Exposure to green space has been well researched to be able to reduce things like blood pressure, stress levels, and also improve mental health. And of course, social interaction with people as they have in these spaces are also, of course, related to decreased inflammation and blood pressure and increased life expectancy. Next slide. So I just want to note that I don't offer these cases as sort of a way or a prescriptive or something that we should be moving towards, but more of they're just some examples of different ways of being that could potentially help with some of the problems that we're seeing that are interrelated problems that I've been talking about. They really move away from, trying to increase or up the ante with different kinds of technologies to moving towards more elegant, low-tech regenerative practices. They do utilize a lot of local, indigenous, and traditional knowledges to be able to work with the ecosystems that they're involved in. They also engage in democratic community participation and more collaboration, emphasizing a lot of care within their communities. And again, like I said, these cases are not meant to be prescriptive. They're just some examples. And I think it's important for us as a community to be thinking about alternatives and to really work through the kinks. How could we live differently? How could we live in a way that doesn't have these horrific unintended consequences? How can we live in ways that are more socially equitable, that are, more enjoyable to live in, and that are also more environmentally healthy to live in? And how can we live in a space where we don't have to worry about moving towards a 4 degrees rise in global average temperatures here in the next potentially 30 years or 40 years? Next slide. And that's all I have for you today. Thanks for listening.